Good morning. Welcome to our monthly webinar. Now, recently the FBI launched a course for financial advisors and wealth planners. This course, called Psychology of Financial Planning, is designed to equip financial planning professionals with the knowledge and tools to better understand their clients. Now, for those of you that have attended our webinars over the last 18 months or so, would know all too well that we believe at Amity wholeheartedly that behavioral finance should be added to your financial planning philosophy. Whether you believe in a traditional financial planning method, or whether you have incorporated behavioral finance already and believe in goals-based, values-based, or client-centric financial planning, there's no real right or wrong. But perhaps there's a better way of helping your client flourish, a better way to help your client achieve a state of financial well-being. Our financial behavior is influenced by factors like our personality traits, our culture, and our money experience, to name a few. Our money experience also has an influence on our money decisions and actions as it shapes our beliefs and attitudes about money. We need to better understand what motivates our clients and how or why they make decisions, because this will drive their behavior. So this morning we have Marius van der Merwe, who will share with us some valuable research and insights on this topic.
Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that the topic we'll discuss would trigger some thinking and hopefully help you to enhance the value that you offer your clients. I want to start off this morning's discussion to ask you this question. How do you measure the success of your advice? Do you measure it by the income you generate, the number of new clients you get? Maybe the fact that you don't lose clients is a good indicator. Now, these are all, without any argument, indicators that you are doing something right. But the question is, how do you measure the success of the advice you deliver to clients? How has your advice proposition changed your client's life? Has the fact that the funds you recommended outperforming their peers or the lower standard deviation of the client's portfolio changed their life in any way? Although these are important from an investment management perspective, that is not what clients value when it comes to advice. Now, I've come across some surveys which looked at what do clients actually want from investment advisors. What do they value or place the highest value on when it comes to seeking advice from financial advisors? And these are the things that came out. Now, this study, for instance, was done a while ago by the CFA Institute. And there are regular studies like these that are done, obviously, or surveys that are done. But this specific one identified the following 7 things that clients said they put value on. Now, the first one being, I want advice that empowers me to have a life well lived. Now, this is an interesting point because there are 2 key words here that stands out for me. The one being, it empowers me. I don't want advice. I don't want someone else to give me a plan. I want to be in control. I want to have the skills, the ability, the knowledge, the context, etc., to manage my financial affairs. The second thing that stands out is a life well lived. Well, this is not something that you would expect from financial advice. That sounds like a life planner. But the point is, they want to link the financial side of things to how they finance their life, how to live this life, my ideal life. And the second thing they said that they want is, I want advice that helps me achieve my goals with tailored solutions. Now, once again, when they described tailored solutions, or when they were sort of prompted, what do they mean by that? The words they used was to say, I want to have context. I want to understand why you recommend this specific solution and how this solution is actually going to solve my problem, is going to benefit me in achieving what I want to achieve, my goals, etc. Another thing they mentioned is, I want advice that helps me make better financial decisions. I want advice that will protect my portfolio, was another point they mentioned. Which is also quite an interesting point, because if you think about protection rather than growth being the primary thing that they think of when it comes to advice, we tend to think, rather, not always, we tend to think that clients, it comes to us to get better growth. Yet what they say is, in the context of the world we live in, preservation and protection is very important to me. And that links up obviously with how people are, loss averse and experience. You would maybe know the research that has been done by Professor Kahneman, where he spoke about, or showed in prospect theory, that people experience twice as much pain from losses than they experience joy from gains. And that basically talks back to this point that clients say, we want to know how you're going to protect my portfolio as being one of the value elements that they highlight. Then they also said, I want advice that gives me control. Comes back to empowerment. They also said, I want advice that gives me peace of mind. Advice that instills trust. These were the key things that clients highlighted as being important to them and what they value. Now, if this is what clients say they want and value most from financial advice, what should be the value proposition of financial advisors? What should it focus on? Now, we need to shift the focus from this is the asset allocation needed, or these are the best funds, to how can I influence my clients' financial behavior so that they are able to finance their ideal life? The purpose of financial planning should be more than the financial outcome. It should guide the client to financial well-being. The ultimate state of being is what psychologists call flourishing. Now, financial advice can play a critical role in helping clients to flourish. Research shows that financial well-being is one of the most important factors or domains for overall well-being. The financial domain has a direct impact on the other 5 life domains which are deemed important for overall well-being. People with financial well-being are, for instance, healthier. They have stronger immune systems, some of the research has proven. And they are even able to cope better when health issues arise. They recover quicker from illnesses and things like that. Financial well-being also has an influence, for instance, on relationships. Statistics in the US, for instance, shows that close to 40% of divorces is because of money issues. A lot of conflict in relationships starts because of financial issues. So we also know the saying, money makes money. Well, it turns out that people with good financial well-being earn higher income and they build more wealth. And that is why I'm of the opinion that the value proposition of financial planners should be enabling financial well-being. Now, to enable financial well-being, financial planning must deliver 4 key things. The first one that advice should do is it should help the client experience control. So the control in the here and now, the present moment. They want to feel in control of, or they should experience that they can keep their standard of living or maintain their standard of living, their lifestyle. They are able to pay their bills every month, send the kid to school, whatever the case may be. It's interesting, though, that if you look at the research on financial well-being, there's a negative correlation to budgeting. So we as people hate budgeting. However, there's a positive correlation to monitoring our financial affairs, which was an interesting finding. So the first thing is have control over our current lifestyle, being able to pay the bills. The second area of financial well-being that we need to address is then to ensure that they experience peace of mind, have security. Whether it's through insurance, whether it's medical aid, whatever the case may be, or even the way the portfolio is structured so that I know that my future lifestyle will be sustained and protected in some way. These are all emotions that clients want to experience if they ultimately want to experience financial well-being. The third dimension of financial well-being is we need to enable them to enjoy their money. Now, enjoyment, if you think about it, it's not just about saving for the future. We want to know that we can take our kids to Wimpy and have a Wimpy breakfast without breaking the bank, without it actually leading to us losing control over our current financial affairs. And then last dimension is that we need to help to give them hope for the future. And that is where goal setting, working towards something in future that will pull us forward and give us this hope of what Shabarat calls wealth mobility. We need to feel that our wealth position, or position of wealth rather, can move forward and we can improve over time. Those kind of things all play out to ultimately giving a client financial well-being. However, our financial planning philosophy and processes needs then to be adapted in some way if this is the outcome we want to deliver. Client behavior needs to be looked at. So have you had a client not implementing the financial plan you recommended, or had difficulty keeping a client to an investment strategy when markets were bad or going south, and they move the money at inappropriate times that you knew was the wrong time to do this? Well, we all have. Why is this so difficult for us to do the right thing, even if we know what the right thing is to do? We know people are not rational. If they were, we would have had a lot more gyms and fewer fast food outlets. There's a clear dislocation between what we should do and what we actually do. Now, there can be no argument, about the defining role that behavior plays in the financial success of a client. The challenge we have is that responsible financial behavior does not come naturally to us as humans. Professor Brad Klontz, a money psychologist, makes the point that humans are not wired for the rules of modern money management. Our ancestors had to hunt for their food to survive, and then they had to use what they found, and what was left over they had to share with the tribe so that the tribe will look after you tomorrow. So delayed gratification, therefore, goes against our DNA. Now, added to this, our financial behavior is influenced by factors like our personality traits, our culture, our money experience, just to name a few. Now, as an example, research found that personality traits like locus of control, time orientation, and self-control are key personality traits that influences our financial behavior. So people with an external locus of control, that would mean that they they feel that they have an influence on the outcomes in their life and that they can control the outcomes or their destiny in some way. People that have a longer term time orientation, and people that are more self-controlled rather than being very impulsive. Those are typical character traits, or personality traits rather, that leads to experiencing financial well-being more naturally. Secondly, our culture plays a major role. So a culture where it's very individualistic focused, success is measured in terms of material type of items, or materialistic type of culture. Those kind of cultures, for instance, have more difficulty in experiencing financial well-being, because it's difficult to sort of reach a point where you experience satisfaction, or then contentment, as opposed to where it's a group culture and success is measured more sort of how the group is performing rather than the individual. Then also our money experience can also have a major influence on our money decisions and our money behavior ultimately. Our beliefs and attitudes, the experience we had as children, for instance, when it comes to money, the way that our parents dealt with that, with money, and what we saw or experienced in our early childhood has, for instance, an impact on our money behavior later on in life. So financial capability, our financial literacy, all of these things are determinants of financial behavior, and financial behavior ultimately is the primary driver then of financial well-being. So it is also important then to look at, or to note rather, that financial well-being is not just about how much we have, but also about our perception of how much we have. This could be of value to advisors. If the planning process can help to shape a positive perception of the client's financial circumstances, it could go a long way in preventing the adverse effect of bad financial behavior. We need to understand that bad financial behavior does not only have a financial cost, it also has an emotional and a relational cost. So we are aware of the so-called behavior gap, or the loss of returns due to incorrect sort of financial behavior. It's been found to be anywhere between 1.5% to 3.5%, depending on who did the study. So Dalbar found it to be, I think, 1.5%, if I remember correctly, and some other organizations found it to be about 3.5%. That's the so-called gamma, or the advisor value, when it comes to actually guiding or coaching the client's behavior, the impact that could have on a portfolio's outcomes. But negative financial perceptions also has an emotional cost. If you think about the anxiety that a client would experience, for instance, when markets are down, and things like that. Whether it's regret that they have for making the wrong decisions, or maybe a feeling that I chose the wrong advisor, or anxiety regarding the sustainability of my lifestyle. These emotions all contribute to a feeling of dissatisfaction, and maybe even that the financial advice does not meet my expectation and therefore does not add value. So how can we use behavior then to improve financial well-being? First, I would like to remind all of the difference between cognitive and emotional biases. Cognitive biases are information processing or memory errors that cause our decisions to deviate from rationality. These biases, which include things like a confirmation bias or mental accounting, can be corrected through financial planning interventions. How we frame returns, for instance, maybe show what the long-term return profile is like, rather than anchoring the client in the returns of the recent past. We can, for instance, show what the consequences of a recent market correction is on the long-term standard of living of the client. The second category of biases is emotional. Emotional biases is a mental state, or that arises spontaneously rather than through conscious processes. So emotions arise from internal beliefs, our perceptions, our feelings, and these are not easy to correct and may require the advisor to adapt the financial plan to accommodate these emotional biases. There is a view, for instance, that when a client is more emotionally driven, then advisors need to be very careful to expose the client to too much volatility in a portfolio, as their behavior will possibly derail the strategy when things go south. Therefore, they need to adapt the portfolio to the client as opposed to sort of giving the client what they actually require. Whereas with cognitive biases, the advisor can actually guide the client and show them through the way that we communicate with them that they are actually you're sort of interpreting information or processing information in an incorrect way. So where the so typically things like loss aversion, regret aversion, overconfidence, these are typical examples of emotional biases. So to come back to the question, how can we use behavior to improve financial well-being? Now, to illustrate this, I want to use my own behavior as an example. I sometimes laugh at how stupid I can be, only sometimes. I will move heaven and earth to get to the gym just to ensure that I reach my weekly goal. It even influences what exercise I would do at the gym, dependent on how many points I still need for that week. It has nothing to do with responsible, healthy behavior and everything to do with me not wanting to miss the goal. Now, the result is good, healthy behavior. The question is how to adapt our financial planning process to tap into what motivates people and influences their behavior. Now, to do this, we first need to expand our client discovery process. We need to develop our client's money biography to help us get a better understanding of the client's money beliefs, their money attitude, the level of financial literacy that they have, the kind of money experiences they had in the past and how that shaped their thinking about money. And even then, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of something like their personality traits to get a better understanding of that. Our clients' so-called money scripts can help us with how we frame the important concepts when we communicate with them. It influences the recommendation of a suitable portfolio and assists us in guiding the client's financial behavior. We need a better understanding of what motivates them and how they make decisions, because this will drive their behavior. That is why something like values-based planning, for instance, or discovering what is important to the client, their values, not moral values, but really the important life spheres and dimensions that in which they have key things that drives them and are important to them. To identify those values, because that taps into what the client deems to be important to them, which in turn can help to get more engagement by creating goals that are more personal instead of just being generic financial goals. It is a decision between saving and a Starbucks cappuccino, chances are that the capo will win every time. But if it's a decision between the capo or sending Liam, my son, to varsity, I may think twice. So connecting wealth to life changes the motivation for following and sticking to the plan. We also need to be what Professor Meyer-Statman calls our clients' financial physicians. We need to provide our clients with a regular financial health check. Our annual review needs to reflect the progress the client has made and what the consequences are of their current financial position on the long-term sustainability of their current and desired lifestyle. Mitch Anthony says we should not have a review meeting, we should have a preview meeting. Now, when it comes to investment planning, we also need to incorporate behavioral profiling, as opposed to just determining the risk tolerance of the client. Understanding the client's investment archetype, for instance, can help us identify these biases and what kind of biases they are. How the client may react in certain market conditions, etc., is critical in guiding and coaching the client through the financial journey. That is why we at Amity, for instance, are developing a behavioral profiling tool, which would include not only risk perception or risk preference or risk composure, which are typical risk tolerance type of dimensions, but also financial behavior and key personality factors, which will help to enhance the suitability evaluation or arriving then ultimately at a more suitable investment solution for the client, which are both behaviorally appropriate, but also then based on sound financial or rather investment principles. The key is to get the client engaged in the planning process and ensure that the end result of the planning process is that the client is empowered to manage their money in a way that will help them live a better life. That is where something like goals-based planning can be very valuable. Now, I want to start this discussion about goals-based planning by maybe just asking you this. Which of the following two questions do you think is the client most interested in? How can I get better returns? Or how can I achieve my goals, my major life goals maybe, with some degree of certainty? Money is seldom an end in itself. More often than not, it is a means to an end, because a goal-based approach focuses on the lifestyle the client wants and has, and protecting or maintaining that, and then maybe improving that over time, because it focuses on the big events that the client potentially anticipates, a child getting married, a parent that they need to take care of, or whatever the case may be, but also the experiences they want to have in life. It means that we tap into the fears and dreams of the client. These are all emotions that drives motivation. It moves the focus from the money to what the money is for. And this changes the reference point for success and ultimately influences our financial behavior. Research in behavioral sciences has shown us, financial well-being is influenced, for instance, by how we frame things, our perception. Our behavior and decisions are determined by what motivates us rather than by what we know. We do mental accounting. We do not have a single risk profile. These are all findings from the behavioral sciences that talks to how we as human beings actually behave and act, not in relation to being rational, but really more being sort of driven by other factors. So how is goals-based planning then different from a traditional planning? And I want to start this discussion by asking this question. How do we measure the success of our advice to clients? Remember, that was the question we started off with? Well, I want to repeat that question again. So the first difference in a goals-based planning process is it redefines success. Conventional planning is often focused on defining success in terms of required returns, the product needed to get these returns. So our approach to advice is therefore very often the reason clients measure success on relative performance, because that is how we frame it for them. A goal-based approach defines success in terms of goal progress and goal achievement. It changes the conversation from alphas or standard deviation to the progress made in achieving the goal. It reports on the consequences of current financial position on the goal that needs to be achieved, and then actions that need to be taken jointly. It makes the planning process, therefore, more collaborative. Instead of placing the responsibility for the plan on the advisor. A second difference in goal-based approach is that how it defines risk. Where the traditional planning approach defines risk in terms of volatility or standard deviation, a goal-based approach defines risk in terms of the probability of not achieving the goal. It therefore considers the loss of capital as well as the return that can be achieved with a high level of certainty as opposed to some relative benchmark like beating an index or a category average or whatever the case may be. Thirdly, a goals-based approach is different in how risk profiling is done. The behavioral science has found that clients do not have a single risk profile, and that has been traditionally the way that we profile clients. We do a risk tolerance questionnaire at the beginning of the investment, when we do the investment assessment or proposal, and that is sort of applicable to the total portfolio. But a client can be loss averse, risk averse, and risk seeking, dependent on the type of goal and how important that goal is for the client. Whether it's an essential goal or an aspirational goal has an influence on how I perceive risk and what kind of risk I'll be willing to take. I always use the example, if I want to take my wife to Venice for our 35th wedding anniversary, that is an aspirational goal. If we don't achieve it, we go to Derbs. If it works, well, hopefully she'll still stick with me. But the point is, that is an aspirational goal. An essential goal is where it's about sending my son to varsity, for instance, or it's about maintaining my standard of living and paying the bills at the end of the month. Even though I am someone that is not scared to take risk, the fact of the matter is when it comes to that kind of investing, my mind frame is different when it comes to evaluating risk. So where the traditional approach is to do the single risk profile once at the beginning and then apply that to the total portfolio, a goal-based approach incorporates multiple risk profiles based on each specific goal. It also implies that risk profiling should maybe not be done only once, as life events happen that changes my financial circumstances and ultimately influences my perception of risk and what I'm willing to accommodate in my portfolio. Now, this does not mean that we need to change the investment strategy every year. It just means that it equips us to understand where the client is in their thinking and to ensure that the portfolio is still suitable and aligned for the outcomes that the client wants to achieve. Now, some of the challenges that financial advisors tell us that they experience very often is they would say, we do the risk questionnaire or risk tolerance questionnaires, we develop goals, but ultimately we end up, sort of with the same type of investment solutions when we construct portfolios for the client. We use balanced funds, when the investment term is 5 years or whatever, or longer, etc. It's standard portfolios at the end of the day. We even have difficulty sometimes to marry the risk profile with the requirement. Sometimes that leads to a discrepancy, and which one do you then choose? They also tell us, we have these standard measures in the industry of portfolio performance, which ultimately then forces us to compare the performance to some relative benchmark. So in the absence of anything else, that means that the client's reference point is performance. They default to that. And they then compare their portfolio's performance to, some or other relative benchmark. Another challenge advisors tell us is they don't necessarily always have robust rules for rebalancing. So what we find is that clients would be invested in a portfolio, and that may be the portfolio for 10 plus years maybe, and no adjustments are made to those portfolios as and when needed. Now, that's not to advocate that there should be made changes to portfolios at all times, but there may be good reasons, and that's why it's important to have specific rules in terms of when to rebalance and how to rebalance. There's also drift that happens in the portfolio from time to time, which needs to, means that we need to realign the client's portfolio again to a specific strategic asset allocation or to some other risk profile or whatever the case may be. So a goals-based approach, I would argue, has 7 properties that has practical value for financial planning. The first one being it provides clarity. Clearly stated goals define what is to be achieved. It quantifies the expectation both for the advisor and for the client and sets the focus point for measuring success. It incorporates things like the importance of the goal, what kind of goal it is, the priority of certain goals for the client, and things like that. Secondly, it means you can customize the portfolio or the plan. It allows for developing a bespoke portfolio for a client, tailored to their behavioral profile, their risk capacity, as well as the desired outcome. It also leads to risk specificity, which allows the advice to be more specific with regards to appropriate risk for each goal, as opposed to evaluating the risk on a total portfolio basis. Another benefit of this approach is risk compliance, because it provides a robust framework for evaluating suitability. It allows for more client-centric communication. It provides a framework, for instance, for behavioral coaching, how we provide feedback in the context of the goals, which means we use more goal language rather than investment language, which is more personal to the client. It also leads to more efficient portfolios, not necessarily from an efficient frontier perspective or a fundamentally sound investment theory perspective, but it is more behaviorally efficient. And we have already seen the big impact that behavior can have actually on the outcome that the client experiences. Then it also provides for rules for rebalancing. Changing life events can be incorporated, market conditions as it changes, and the discussion can be on the implications of a bad market experience over the last year and how it impacts the sustainability of the client's lifestyle, what actions need to be taken, etc. And also to a more client-specific strategic asset allocation can be made in this kind of approach. So this brings us to the question of portfolio construction and the investment philosophy. Outcomes-based investing. So if a private investor defines success in absolute terms, like achieving a goal, and risk not necessarily as volatility, but as the probability of not achieving the goal, shouldn't the investment strategy then incorporate some of these definitions in how and measurements? Given that investor behavior plays a critical role in a successful investment experience, should behavioral factors not be considered in the investment strategy? Now, the traditional investment strategy, which is built on modern portfolio theory, capital asset pricing models, and the efficient frontier, assumes that private investors want to optimize return for each unit of risk. This approach does not take into account the fact that goals differ in terms of their importance, in terms of the time horizon, as well as the risk profile. So the traditional investment strategies also has no specific time horizon, and therefore the sequence of returns are not as important. The traditional investment philosophy uses historic returns of asset classes and then as well as correlations to arrive at an expected return. But these returns often don't realize within the goal time framework. Now on the downside, we see that correlation changes over time, which means that time diversification often does not work as well as a risk strategy. Correlations often increase substantially in terms of crisis, like COVID-19 or the GFC. All this means that the criteria by which investments should be managed for private investors are different from institutional investors, which I would argue is what the majority of the investment management industry is built on. So an outcomes-based investment strategy is probably the most suitable for private investors and is one of the reasons why it has gained so much traction with wealth managers across the world over the last 10 years. The focus of an outcomes-based strategy is aligned with what clients mentioned as being important to them. Help me achieve my goals and protect my portfolio. So what is outcomes-based investing? An outcomes-based investment philosophy is built on reducing uncertainty of a predefined range of outcomes over a specified investment term. So 3 things there: predefined range, higher probability, specific time frames. 3 key things that are linked to achieving specific goals. The focus is not on maximizing, the focus is on maximizing the probability of achieving the outcome, and then the consistency of achieving this outcome over rolling investment periods. So instead of aiming to deliver the highest return given the prevailing market conditions, an outcomes-based investment strategy is founded on what return can be delivered with the highest probability through different market cycles within a specific investment horizon. So how is this different? The first difference is the fact that the traditional approach has a single reference point. Whether it's a target return, CPI plus 3, 4, 5, or whatever the case may be, with an outcomes-based strategy, we look at target wealth and a threshold wealth. 2 key things that allows for focusing the client not on a single measure, which often, if we underperform that measure, it leads to anxiety. When the markets are outperforming that measure, then all of a sudden the client thinks they can spend more money. With a threshold wealth, it allows also from a financial planning perspective to have a high level of confidence in terms of the plan, but then also to plan for eventualities. We don't have control over what happens in markets. So this is sort of a what-if scenario. If we achieve the threshold wealth, how would that impact the achievement of the goal? Should more capital be allocated to this goal to reduce the risk and enhance the probability of getting the outcome? So what you can see is by following this kind of approach, you are actually engaging the client in the process and not to make the markets to sort of realize this goal, but it's a collaborative process. You need the seed to get the harvest. With insufficient seed, we can't up the risk in the portfolio and try and target ridiculous returns just to make the goal work. And that is where this kind of approach adds value. Secondly, it's more about a predictable growth versus an expected return. So the traditional approach looks at expected returns, whereas an outcomes-based strategy, as I mentioned, looks at, for instance, what is the kind of return that you can achieve with a high level of consistency over a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, whatever period. So if you look at something like a CPI plus 6 target, what is the probability of achieving that? So if you look at over the last 20 years as an example, CPI plus 6 from local equity can be achieved with roughly about a 50% probability. That's a 10-year investment horizon. So doing a plan for a client and we have a 50% chance of success. How does that play out in terms of creating more confidence for the client and peace of mind? Also, a traditional approach has more of a relative benchmark that they measure against, whereas opposed to an outcomes-based using a more absolute benchmark. We look at a probability-based type of strategy when it comes to outcomes-based investing, as opposed to using market expectations and valuations of counters and things like that. Also, an outcomes-based investment approach is much more focused on managing risk actively. So it follows much more of a top-down approach. Very few investment strategies would have a clearly quantified risk budget. What is the worst outcome that we would allow over any rolling 1-year period, for argument's sake, in this kind of strategy? Whereas with an outcomes-based investing strategy, that becomes one of the key criteria that you will build into your portfolio. It focuses on the sequence of returns and of risk then versus more terminal wealth when it comes to the traditional approach. Bearing in mind that a typical investment strategy, whether it's a multi-asset balanced or whatever the case may be, because there's no end date, there's no specific time frame where you know that there's a liability that needs to be paid at that specific point in time. That means you may think of in terms of having time to ride through certain bad markets before you actually get to that kind of expected growth that you would achieve. So there are 4 criteria used that we use, for instance, to measure an outcomes-based strategy. Let's call it 4 pillars that we build an outcomes-based strategy on. The first one is a clearly defined outcome, threshold wealth and the targeted wealth. What is that number that we need to achieve? Secondly, what is the probability with which that outcome can be achieved? What is the consistency with which it can be achieved? Actively managing the risk, and then in the last place, preserving the capital first. So the threshold wealth would typically be something like at least achieving a return equal to inflation over the investment horizon to preserve the capital as a starting point. So first preserve, then grow. So to illustrate this, I'd like to show you these graphs as an example. So typically how we look at it, we would, for instance, look at it from the perspective of saying, we want to have a 90% probability that we can at least achieve the threshold wealth over the investment horizon, whether that be a rolling 3-year period, rolling 5-year period, rolling 7-year period. A 90% probability of achieving threshold wealth or better. Okay. Secondly, what we look at is we want to have at least a 50% plus probability of achieving the targeted wealth level. That means that there's about a 30% probability that you may end up somewhere between the threshold wealth and the targeted wealth. But what this allows from a financial planning perspective is to sort of create these what-if scenarios and put action plans in place so that you give more control to the client. What happens then on the downside? That 10% where the threshold wealth is underperformed. Well, the focus, as I said, is what is the maximum drawdown that we allow in the portfolio over a 12-month period, as an example. And then also, how quickly will the portfolio recover? So we look at asset class recovery periods and things like that when these portfolios are constructed from these building blocks. So the process to achieve this means that you need to follow more of a building block approach. So asset allocation, having control over the strategic asset allocation of the solution is critical. The starting point is really doing research on how these different asset classes on an index level perform and deliver the outcome. And then the second question comes into play to ask, can we find managers that can actually enhance on this outcome, that beat the index with a high level of consistency and things like that. So the whole question of passive and active actually has a clear framework with which we can make that decision to say when we can't find managers that can add this consistent value, whether it be through alpha generation or whether it be through risk management in their portfolios, there's a clear scorecard that can be used to evaluate passive versus active inclusions. And then ultimately, the third decision, how do we construct the portfolio? How do these funds work together in conjunction to create a specific equity carve-out, bond carve-out, whatever the case may be? And how does these two funds, for instance, or three funds, or how many ever you want to use, how does that actually add value to ultimately reduce risk and lead to a more consistent outcome? And that basically brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for spending time with us. I hope it has been insightful and that maybe we just stimulated some thinking in terms of how you do your financial planning and how do you construct your portfolios.